Joining us now from Reading, Connecticut is Saul Cornell, Professor of American History at Fordham University, and a very good evening to you.
Thank you for having me on.
Just talk us through the history of the Second Amendment, which enshrines the right to bear arms, of course. How did it come about?
Well, the Second Amendment is part of 18th century Anglo-American history. It actually derives from the English background, where you had a fear of standing armies and you had the idea of the militia as a part of this country Whiggish reform movement. And so Americans took that idea and they implemented the militia. And remember, Americans are living on the edge of the British Empire in the 18th century. They're dealing with hostile Indians who are not very happy about having their land taken. They have geopolitical rivals in Spain and France. So the militia is absolutely essential because you don't have police forces, you don't have an army, and the militia in a way becomes not just important for its military function, but it becomes sort of everything from the Boy Scouts and the Rotary Club all rolled into one, because it becomes an essential building block of local communities.
Guns have presumably evolved since the 18th century. Have the gun laws?
Well, we've always had gun laws. There's nothing new about regulating firearms. I mean, America they're not only gun laws at the time of the Second Amendment. America also carried forward a number of traditions from England, a number of regulations, for instance, prohibitions on traveling armed in populous areas. That actually goes back to the 14th century in the Statute of Northampton. So America's always had gun laws. In fact, they actually got more robust, stronger after the Second Amendment. But it's only in the last 25 to 30 years that we've had this radical gun rights ideology that has essentially hijacked the Second Amendment, weaponized it, and turned it into a bumper sticker and a slogan, so that you just hear people spout the word Second Amendment, and that's supposed to close down discussion. But the Second Amendment doesn't actually bar gun regulation. It actually compels it. We wouldn't have been able to have a militia unless government had passed a variety of laws that armed the militia, kept track of who was in the militia, required people to report to muster. So the historical reality and the mythology around the Second Amendment are really quite at odds with one another.
That's very interesting. What's the difference between federal gun laws and the gun laws that individual states can make? Presumably they can be much more lenient or much stronger.
Well, of course, America has this federal system where certain legal responsibilities are part of the federal government's responsibility, and the more day-to-day kinds of things belong to the state. So essentially, if you're talking about commerce and the selling of guns, that really is a federal area of concern. Interstate commerce is something the federal government has control over. If you're talking about how guns are used as a matter of day-to-day reality, things like whether you can carry one, whether or not you need to store it in a particular manner, those traditionally have been things we've left to the states, because let's face it, gun laws that would make sense for the Bronx in New York would probably not be appropriate for Alaska. And so I think what we need as a country is to recognize that guns travel across state borders, so we need to regulate that aspect of guns nationally. But whether or not you need to take a gun with you when you walk to your garage and there are grizzly bears if you're in Alaska, well, that's very different than if you're living in Boston, New York, Chicago, or New Orleans, or Miami. So there's always going to be some variety, because gun cultures are very different. New England has always had very tight gun laws and low rates of gun violence. But of course, the South, areas where slavery was an important part of that heritage, has always had very high levels of gun violence.
Professor Saul Cornell from Fordham University. We've got to leave it there. Good to talk to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me.